The hospital waiting room smelled like bleach and fear. My father sat across from me, his face twisted with disgust as my boyfriend held my trembling hand. "Mental illness doesn't exist in this family," Dad hissed, loud enough for everyone to hear. "She's damaged goods now. You should leave while you can." 6 years later, when his golden child son swallowed a bottle of pills, Dad would call me sobbing. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. My name is Sarah, and at 24, I thought I had everything figured out. I worked as a pediatric nurse at Children's Hospital in Denver, spending 12-hour shifts comforting sick kids and worried parents. Every morning, I'd wake up at 5 a.m., make breakfast for my younger siblings before school, and drive 40 minutes to work with a smile on my face. The sunrise would paint the mountains gold through my windshield, and I'd sip my coffee thinking about all the little lives I'd help save that day. Being a nurse wasn't just my job. It was my calling, my identity. The thing that made my father occasionally look at me with something approaching pride. I was the responsible one, the caretaker, the daughter who never complained. While my brother Michael played video games in his childhood bedroom at 26, I paid my own bills, helped Mom with groceries, and still showed up for every family dinner. I remember the weight of my student loans, $47,000 that I chipped away at with every overtime shift, never once asking my parents for help even though they'd paid for Michael's failed attempt at business school without blinking. I thought sacrifice meant love. I thought being indispensable meant being valued. My apartment was small, but mine, decorated with plants I kept alive through sheer determination and photos of families I'd helped at the hospital. Parents would send me pictures of their kids growing up healthy, beating cancer, overcoming surgeries that should have killed them. Those pictures covered my refrigerator like armor, proof that I mattered, that I was good, that I was worthy of taking up space in the world. My boyfriend Jake would joke that we needed a bigger fridge just for my fan mail. He'd kiss my forehead and tell me I was too good for this world, and I'd believe him because I needed to believe something. Jake was everything my father approved of. Tall, stable job in finance, came from what Dad called good stock. He'd been my college sweetheart, the boy who walked me home from the library at midnight, who brought me soup during finals week, who proposed on our 5th anniversary with my grandmother's ring he'd secretly gotten from my mom. We were supposed to get married in the fall, have 2 kids, buy a house in the suburbs where Dad could play grandfather on weekends. It was all planned out, every detail perfect, every box checked. But perfection is a house built on sand, and I was about to learn what happens when the tide comes in. You see, while I was busy being the perfect daughter, the perfect nurse, the perfect fiancée, something inside me was quietly breaking. Mental illness doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It creeps in like fog, so gradual you don't notice you're lost until you can't see your hand in front of your face. And in my family, being lost wasn't an option. We were successful, stable, superior to those weak people who needed therapists and medication. We handled our problems ourselves, behind closed doors, with silence and scotch. I thought being good meant being loved. I thought sacrifice meant security. I was wrong about everything. This is my story of falling apart, being abandoned, and ultimately finding out that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the foundation for the best thing you'll ever become. Sunday dinners at my parents' house were sacred. Every week without fail, I'd pull into the curved driveway of their colonial home at exactly 4 p.m., watching the same neighbors walking their golden retrievers, hearing the same wind chimes Mom bought at an art fair 20 years ago. The dining room would fill with the smell of Mom's pot roast, garlic and rosemary mixing with the lemon pledge she used religiously on the mahogany table. Dad would hold court at the head of the table, telling stories from his construction business while Michael laughed at all the right moments, even the ones we'd heard 100 times before. The routine was choreographed like a dance I knew by heart. I'd arrive early to help Mom in the kitchen, peeling potatoes while she basted the roast, neither of us talking much but comfortable in our shared silence. She'd pat my hand occasionally, leaving flower fingerprints on my skin that I'd treasure like temporary tattoos of her affection. Michael would stumble in around 5 p.m., usually hungover but showered, wearing the same polo shirt he'd worn for 3 years of Sunday dinners. Dad would emerge from his study precisely at 5:30, bourbon in hand, ready to survey his kingdom. Jake started joining us 6 months into our relationship, and by year 3, he had his own assigned seat between me and Mom. He'd learned exactly how to compliment Mom's cooking to make her blush, how to ask Dad about work to keep him talking, how to deflect when Michael made snide comments about my Mother Teresa complex at the hospital. Under the table, Jake would trace circles on my knee with his thumb, a secret language that said, "We're a team," while Dad droned on about concrete prices and lazy contractors. Those were the golden hours when Dad would actually look at me with something close to pride. "Sarah's saving lives at the hospital," he'd tell his business partners when they visited, his chest puffing out like I was his accomplishment. "First one in the family to get a degree. Graduated. Summa cum laude." He'd always emphasize the Latin, even though he didn't know what it meant. Mom would beam from her corner, Michael would roll his eyes and reach for another beer, and I'd feel like maybe, just maybe, I belonged at this table I'd eaten at my whole life. After dinner, Mom and I would wash dishes while the men watched football, our hands working in synchronized rhythm. She'd wash, I'd dry, a system perfected over decades. She'd tell me about her week, little complaints about Dad leaving his socks everywhere, pride about Michael finally fixing the garage door, questions about when Jake and I would give her grandchildren. These quiet moments felt like the real family, the soft spaces between performances where we could almost be ourselves. Saturday mornings meant coffee with Jake at our favorite cafe, Grounded, where baristas knew our names and always drew hearts in my foam. The place was cramped and usually too loud, full of college students on laptops and young families with sticky toddlers, but it was ours. We'd share the newspaper like an old married couple, him reading sports while I tackled the crossword, our feet tangled under the tiny table. Jake would steal bites of my blueberry muffin, I'd drink half his orange juice, and we'd plan our future between sections of newsprint. "2 kids," he'd say, sketching our dream house on a napkin. "A boy and a girl. The boy first so he can protect his little sister." I'd add a garden to his sketch, marking where I'd plant tomatoes like my grandmother used to grow, the ones that tasted like summer and possibility. We'd debate paint colors and school districts, dog breeds and vacation plans, building our tomorrow with coffee-stained napkins and absolute certainty that our love was different, stronger, unbreakable. Life felt like a quilt being sewn together, each piece falling perfectly into place. I had no idea I was about to watch it all unravel, thread by bloody thread. The headache started in October, right as the leaves began falling. At first, I blamed the harsh hospital lights and double shifts. The fluorescent bulbs in the pediatric ward had always been too bright, but suddenly they felt like needles piercing through my skull. I'd pop 3 Advil with my morning coffee, then 3 more at lunch, telling myself it was just the changing seasons, just the stress of flu season approaching, just anything except what it really was. The insomnia came next, creeping in like a thief. I'd lie awake at 3 a.m. with my heart racing for no reason, counting the shadows the streetlight cast through our bedroom blinds. 1 line, 2 lines, 3 lines on the ceiling, over and over until the numbers blurred together. Jake's peaceful breathing beside me became a mockery of my wakeful state. Some nights I'd slip out of bed and sit on our bathroom floor, pressing my face against the cold tile, trying to understand why my body felt like it was preparing for a war that never came. Then came the crying. Not normal tears, but sudden violent sobs that ambushed me in the strangest moments. Once, I was reaching for supplies in the storage room when my knees buckled, and I found myself gasping between paper towels and boxes of latex gloves, my whole body shaking with grief I couldn't name. My colleague Marcus found me there 20 minutes later, mascara striping my face like war paint. "Bad day?" he asked gently. How could I explain that it wasn't a bad day? It was a bad existence, that something inside me had shifted off its axis, and I couldn't figure out how to shift it back? My hands started shaking during routine procedures. Drawing blood, something I'd done thousands of times, suddenly felt impossible. The needle would tremble as I searched for a vein, and I'd have to excuse myself, letting another nurse take over while I hid in the bathroom, staring at my tremoring fingers like they belonged to someone else. Once, I dropped an entire tray of medications, pills scattering across the floor like colorful confetti, each one representing another piece of my competence rolling away. The weight on my chest grew heavier each day, like someone was slowly stacking bricks on my ribcage. Breathing became conscious work instead of automatic function. I'd sit in my car after shifts, hands gripping the steering wheel, forcing air in and out of my lungs like I was learning to breathe for the first time. The radio would play happy songs that sounded like they were coming from another planet, a place where people didn't have to remind themselves to inhale and exhale. Food lost its taste. Mom's pot roast might as well have been cardboard. Jake's favorite Thai restaurant, where we'd had our first date, now made me nauseous. I'd push pad thai around my plate, creating patterns in the noodles while Jake watched with concern. "You're getting thin," he said one night, his hand finding my prominent collarbone. I told him it was wedding diet, even though our wedding was still 8 months away. He pretended to believe me, but I caught him watching me during meals, counting bites like a worried parent. The worst part was the fog, a gray haze that settled over everything, making the world feel distant and unreal. I'd be talking to patient families, explaining treatment plans, and suddenly feel like I was floating above my own body, watching this nurse who looked like me but couldn't possibly be me, because I couldn't feel anything except this terrible distance from everything I used to love. Colors seemed duller. Laughter sounded hollow. Even Jake's kisses felt like they were happening to someone else's lips. But I kept going, kept smiling, kept showing up. Because in my family, we didn't stop. We didn't break. We certainly didn't admit that something inside us might be cracking beyond repair. I became an expert at pretending. Every morning, I'd stand in front of my bathroom mirror applying concealer. Like armor, layering it thick under my eyes where purple shadows had taken permanent residence. 2 coats of mascara to make my eyes look alive, bronzer to fake the healthy glow I'd lost, lipstick bright enough to distract from the way my smile never quite reached my eyes anymore. Jake would watch from the doorway sometimes, his toothbrush hanging from his mouth, concern etched in the furrow between his brows. "You're beautiful without all that," he'd say. But he didn't understand that the makeup wasn't about beauty. It was about survival, about creating a mask convincing enough to get me through another day. "I'm fine," became my mantra, repeated until the words lost all meaning. When Linda, my supervisor, pulled me aside after I'd forgotten to chart medications for the 3rd time that week, I smiled and said, "I'm fine, just haven't been sleeping well." When my mother noticed I'd barely touched my plate at Sunday dinner, I laughed and said, "I'm fine, just had a late lunch." When Jake found me sitting in our dark living room at 2 a.m., staring at nothing, I kissed his worried face and said, I'm fine, just couldn't sleep. The lie became so automatic I almost believed it myself. I threw myself into work with desperate intensity, thinking purpose would cure whatever this was. I volunteered for every extra shift, stayed late to comfort anxious parents, organized fundraisers for the children's cancer ward. If I could just be useful enough, productive enough, good enough, surely this gray fog would lift. I became the nurse everyone could count on, the one who never said no, who showed up even on her days off. My colleagues started joking that I lived at the hospital, not realizing how close to the truth that was. Home had become the place where I couldn't hide behind tasks and responsibilities, where the silence was too loud and the walls were too close. Dad always said weakness was a choice, and I refused to choose it. His voice echoed in my head during the hardest moments. Cowboys don't cry, he'd told Michael and me when we were kids, even though I was a girl who had never wanted to be a cowboy. Pain is just weakness leaving the body, he'd say when we'd come home with scraped knees or hurt feelings. So I pushed through the pain, convinced that if I was strong enough, it would eventually leave my body like he promised. I ran 5 miles every morning before work, punishing my legs and lungs, hoping physical exhaustion would overshadow mental anguish. It never did. During family dinners, I'd grip my fork to stop my hands from trembling, the metal leaving indentations in my palm that lasted hours. I'd learned to cut my meat into tiny pieces beforehand, easier to manage when your hands won't cooperate. When Mom asked why I'd lost weight, I blamed a new workout routine, flexing my arm to show muscle that was really just bone barely covered by skin. When Michael joked that I looked like a zombie, I laughed it off, the sound harsh and hollow. Hospital life, I'd say, waving my hand dismissively while digging my nails into my thigh under the table, using pain to keep myself present. The worst part was watching Jake try to reach me through the wall I'd built. He'd bring home my favorite flowers, daisies from the farmer's market, and I'd thank him while feeling nothing. He'd suggest weekend trips, concerts, all the things we used to love, and I'd agree, then cancel at the last minute, claiming exhaustion or work emergencies. He started sleeping on his side of the bed like there was an invisible line between us, and I was grateful for the space, even as it broke my heart. Love felt like another performance I was failing at, another way I was letting everyone down. Inside, I was screaming. Inside, I was disappearing one piece at a time, and nobody seemed to notice the parts of me going missing. The panic attack hit me in the middle of a shift on a gray Tuesday afternoon. One moment I was checking vitals on a 6-year-old with pneumonia, listening to her labored breathing through my stethoscope, and the next I was on the floor, gasping for air that wouldn't come. The little girl's mother screamed, thinking I was having a heart attack. In a way, I was. My heart was attacking me, pounding so hard I thought it would explode through my chest wall. The walls closed in, the fluorescent lights above fractured into 1,000 piercing stars, and I was certain, absolutely certain, I was dying. Linda called a code, and suddenly I was the patient, surrounded by colleagues whose faces mixed concern with something else, pity, confusion, maybe even disappointment. They'd seen me as the strong one, the reliable one, and here I was, crumpled on the linoleum floor like a broken doll. Dr. Harrison, who I'd worked beside for 2 years, helped lift me onto a gurney while I sobbed apologies that no one could understand through my hyperventilating. The 6-year-old with pneumonia watched with wide eyes as they wheeled me away, and I remember thinking that I'd become the scary story she'd tell about hospitals. The ER was a blur of familiar faces and unfamiliar roles. My colleagues became my caregivers, starting IVs in arms they'd seen start 1,000 IVs, attaching monitors to a chest they'd seen save dying children. The EKG showed a racing but regular rhythm. Blood work came back normal. No heart attack, no thyroid storm, no physical explanation for why my body had betrayed me so completely. Oxygen levels perfect. Blood pressure slightly elevated, but nothing dangerous. By every medical measure, I was fine. By every human measure, I was falling apart. Dr. Melissa Chen, someone I'd shared countless coffee breaks with, sat on the edge of my bed after the tests came back. Her voice was gentle but professional, the tone I recognized from delivering difficult diagnoses to families. Sarah, it's a panic attack. Your body is physically healthy, but your mind is sending distress signals. She wrote something on a prescription pad, and I knew before she handed it to me what it would say. This is a referral for psychiatry. Dr. Roberts is excellent, very discreet. A lot of us see him, actually. She paused, looking around to make sure we were alone. I see him myself. Have for 3 years now. The paper in my hand felt like evidence of my failure, proof that I was broken in a way that good girls weren't supposed to be. The word psychiatry seemed to pulse on the page like a neon sign advertising my weakness. I thought about all the times Dad had mocked people who needed therapy, calling them soft, weak, attention seekers who couldn't handle real life. Bunch of snowflakes, he'd say, watching news stories about mental health. In my day, we just got on with it. But I couldn't get on with it anymore. My body had staged a revolt in the most public way possible. Jake drove me home in silence, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, jaw clenched so tight I could hear his teeth grinding. The referral sat between us like a loaded gun. Finally, at a red light, he exploded. "How long?" he asked, his voice cracking. "How long have you been hiding this from me? The not sleeping, the not eating, the crying in the bathroom when you think I can't hear. Did you think I was stupid? Did you think I didn't notice you were disappearing?" His anger dissolved into tears. This strong man who'd never cried in front of me now sobbing against the steering wheel. "I've been watching you fade away, and I didn't know how to help because you wouldn't let me in. We need to tell your parents," he finally said as we pulled into our apartment complex. The words hit me like ice water. "No," I whispered. But I knew he was right. The secret was too big to carry alone, and maybe, just maybe, my family would surprise me with support. The psychiatrist's office had soft blue walls and a white noise machine that couldn't drown out my father's voice later that day. Dr. Roberts had been kind, patient, clinical. "Clinical depression and generalized anxiety disorder," he'd explained, showing me pamphlets with stock photos of smiling people. "Very treatable with medication and therapy. You're going to be okay, Sarah." But sitting in my parents' living room 3 hours later, repeating those words to my family, I felt anything but okay. The diagnosis felt like glass in my mouth, each syllable cutting my tongue as I forced them out. Mom reached for my hand across the coffee table, her touch tentative like she was afraid mental illness might be contagious. Dad stood up so fast his chair fell backward, the crash echoing through the house like a gunshot. Michael actually looked up from his phone for once, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth like he'd just won some unspoken competition. Jake sat beside me, his presence the only thing keeping me anchored as my father's face transformed from surprise to rage. "Depression?" Dad spat the word like it tasted rotten, his face turning the particular shade of purple that usually preceded his worst tirades. "That's just fancy talk for being weak. No one in this family has mental illness. We're not those people." He paced in front of the fireplace, his hands clenched into fists, family photos watching from the mantel like witnesses to my humiliation. "What will people think? What will my clients think when they find out my daughter is crazy?" Jim Morrison's daughter went to therapy last year, and now everyone knows. They whisper about it at the country club. That will not happen to us. Jake stood up, defensive, his voice steady but firm. "Mr. Coleman, she's not crazy, she's sick. She needs support, not shame. Mental illness is a medical condition, just like diabetes or—" "Don't you lecture me in my own home, boy." Dad cut him off, wheeling around to face us. His eyes were wild, the vein in his forehead pulsing. I built this family's reputation from nothing. Started laying brick at 16, created an empire. We're respected in this community because we're strong, we're stable. We don't air our dirty laundry for every quack doctor to pick through. He turned to Jake with cold calculation in his eyes, the businessman replacing the father. You seem like a smart boy. Good family, good job, good future ahead of you. Do you really want to tie yourself to damaged goods? The room went silent. Even the grandfather clock seemed to stop ticking. Mom stared at her lap, her hands twisted together so tightly her knuckles went white. Michael leaned back in his chair, enjoying the show like it was prime-time entertainment. Dad continued, his voice dropping to that dangerous whisper that had terrified me as a child. Mental illness is genetic, you know. Think about your future kids. Do you want them inheriting this weakness? Starting life with a strike against them? You could find a healthy girl, someone who won't embarrass you at company parties, someone who won't need pills to get through the day. Jake's hand found mine, but I could feel it trembling. Or maybe that was me. Everything was trembling. The room, the house, the very foundation of everything I thought I knew about my family. Dad walked over to his liquor cabinet, pouring himself 3 fingers of bourbon like this was just another business negotiation. I'm trying to help you here, son. Cut your losses now, before you're in too deep. Before there are kids involved. Before she ruins your life, like she's ruining ours. 3 days later, Jake left. He didn't say it was because of what Dad said, but he didn't have to. The engagement ring he'd been hiding in his sock drawer went with him, along with his hockey trophies and the plant his mother had given us. He took everything except the courage to look me in the eye while he packed. I need time to think, he mumbled, shoving clothes into a duffel bag while I sat on our bed, too numb to cry. Your dad made some points. About the future. About kids. I just need to figure things out. He kissed my forehead before leaving, a Judas kiss that burned for hours after he was gone. Michael showed up at my apartment the next morning, uninvited and unwelcome, sprawled on my couch like he owned the place. He was eating cereal from my bowl, using my last bit of milk, his feet up on my coffee table. Rough week, huh? He said through a mouthful of Lucky Charms, not bothering to hide his satisfaction. Jake seemed like a good guy. Shame about that whole situation. He picked up the photo of Jake and me from the side table, pretending to study it. Dad had a long talk with him, you know. Real heart-to-heart. Mentioned some things about the family business, about inheritance. I felt my stomach drop. What about inheritance? Michael's grin widened, revealing Lucky Charms stuck in his teeth. Oh, you don't know? Dad's been restructuring everything. Has been for months, actually. Ever since you started acting weird at dinners. He could tell something was off with you. He set down the empty bowl on my coffee table, not bothering with a coaster. See, the construction business needs stable leadership. Can't have someone who might have a breakdown running million-dollar projects. Bad for insurance, bad for reputation. So Dad's been transitioning everything to me. The truth unraveled like a cheap sweater, each pulled thread revealing more damage underneath. Michael explained with gleeful detail how Dad had been documenting my instability for months. Every time I'd left dinner early with a headache, every time Mom mentioned I looked tired, every canceled family event. He's got a whole file, Michael said, helping himself to my refrigerator, pulling out the leftover Thai food Jake and I had ordered just last week. Medical leave from work doesn't look good either. He's already telling clients you had a breakdown. Says you might need long-term care. Real shame about your reputation at the hospital, too. What do you mean, my reputation at the hospital? My voice sounded hollow, distant. Dad knows people on the board? George Henderson? They golf together every Saturday? Margaret Chen from HR? Her husband does all the concrete work for Dad's projects. Michael found my hidden stash of Oreos, tearing into them. Amazing how mental illness makes people question your judgment, your competence. Heard there might be a review of your recent patient care. Just to be safe. Can't be too careful with sick kids, right? I felt the walls closing in again, but this time it wasn't panic. It was clarity. Horrible and complete. My own father was systematically destroying my life, using my illness as a weapon. He wasn't just cutting me out of the will. He was cutting me out of existence. Every professional connection, every ounce of credibility I'd built, he was poisoning it all. And Michael, useless Michael who'd never worked, a real day in his life, who'd failed out of business school and spent his days playing video games, was going to inherit everything. Mom knows, Michael added casually, like he was mentioning the weather. She's known the whole time. Where do you think Dad got your work schedule to coordinate his board member meetings? She's been feeding him information for months. They both agreed. Better to have one stable heir than risk the family reputation on damaged goods. He stood up, brushing Oreo crumbs onto my carpet. Anyway, just thought you should know. Dad wanted me to make sure you understood the situation. Says you can still come to family dinners if you get your act together. Stop embarrassing everyone. But the business, the money, the future, that's all mine now. Robert, Mom gasped, but Dad silenced her with a look. Get out, Dad said to me, his voice quiet now, which was worse than yelling. The quietness meant decision, finality, the end of negotiation. Come back when you've sorted yourself out. When you've stopped this attention-seeking nonsense. We don't air dirty laundry in this family, and we certainly don't create it. He took a long sip of bourbon, then delivered the final blow. And Jake, think about what I said. My door's always open to you, with or without her. The next 2 months were the darkest of my life. After Michael left my apartment that day, I called in sick to work, then extended it to a week, then finally took full medical leave when I couldn't force myself out of bed for 3 straight days. The HR conversation was humiliating. Margaret Chen's voice dripping with false sympathy while she mentioned concerns about patient safety and performance reviews that hadn't existed until my father made his calls. I knew she was documenting every word, building a case that had nothing to do with my actual work and everything to do with the narrative Dad was spinning. I stopped answering my phone after the 5th colleague texted to ask if I was okay, in that way that meant they'd heard rumors. The whispers Dad's connections had started spread like cancer through the hospital. Sarah Coleman had a psychotic break. Sarah Coleman can't be trusted with medications. Sarah Coleman might be dangerous around children. Each lie built on the last until the truth didn't matter anymore. My perfect reputation, built over years of dedicated service, crumbled in weeks. The apartment became my prison and my refuge. I'd sit in my bathtub at 2 a.m., fully clothed, letting cold water run over me because feeling something, anything, was better than the numbness that had settled into my bones. The cold made me gasp, made me present, made me remember I was still alive even when I didn't want to be. Sometimes I'd stay there until sunrise, watching the sky lighten through the small bathroom window, my clothes heavy with water, my skin pruned like I'd aged decades in hours. Old photos mocked me from every surface. Sarah, the good daughter at her nursing school graduation. Sarah, the successful professional at the hospital gala. Sarah, the beloved fiancé at last year's Christmas party. I took them down one by one, my hands shaking as I traced the face of the girl who used to smile so easily. Into a cardboard box went every achievement certificate, every commendation letter, every thank you card from grateful families. The evidence of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else, someone who hadn't been deemed worthless by her own family. Jake had blocked my number, but I still wrote him texts I couldn't send. paragraphs at 3 a.m. about how sorry I was for being broken, about how I understood why he left, about how I hoped he'd find someone stable, someone whose father wouldn't call her damaged goods. I'd type until my fingers cramped, then delete everything and start again. Once, I drove to his new apartment at midnight, sitting outside in my car for 2 hours, watching the light in his window, imagining him living a life without the burden of my illness. I left without knocking, because what was there to say? Dad had been right. I was damaged goods, and Jake deserved better. The medication Dr. Roberts prescribed helped with the chemicals in my brain, but couldn't touch the hole in my heart. Sertraline could lift the fog of depression. Xanax could quiet the anxiety. But there was no pill for being abandoned by everyone who was supposed to love you unconditionally. I'd given everything to a family that saw me as an embarrassment, loved a man who ran at the first sign of imperfection, built an identity on being needed by people who discarded me like trash the moment I needed them back. Rock bottom has a specific geography. It's lying on your bathroom floor at 4 a.m., counting the tiles, because counting means you're still cognitive, still functional, still something more than the nothing you feel like. It's ordering groceries online because you can't bear the fluorescent lights of the store. It's wearing the same pajamas for a week, because changing clothes requires a decision you're not capable of making. It's your mother calling once to say she's praying for you, but not offering to visit, not offering to help, not offering anything but distance and disappointment. But here's the thing about rock bottom that no one tells you. It's solid. When you can't fall any further, you finally stop falling. The turning point came from an unexpected source. Linda, my supervisor, who showed up at my door on a rainy Thursday with Thai food and tough love. She didn't call first, didn't ask permission, just used the spare key I'd forgotten she had from when she'd watered my plants during vacation. I was on my couch in 3-day-old pajamas, hair matted, surrounded by tissues and empty medication bottles. She took one look at me, set down the food, and opened every curtain in the apartment. "First things first," she said, "you need light and a shower. Then we talk." An hour later, clean and dressed in fresh clothes she'd made me put on, I sat across from her at my kitchen table while she unpacked pad thai and spring rolls. "Your father's been spreading rumors," she said bluntly, not sugarcoating anything. "But here's the thing, Sarah. I've worked with you for 5 years. I've seen you handle dying children with grace, support grieving parents, train new nurses with patience. I know who you are." She pulled out her phone, showing me a group text with over 30 colleagues. "We all do. And we're not buying his bullshit." She showed me message after message of support. Doctors vouching for my competence, nurses sharing their own mental health struggles, parents of former patients asking how they could help. Dr. Chen, Melissa, not Margaret from HR, had even started documenting the timeline of my father's interference, building a case for workplace harassment. "Depression doesn't erase your competence, Sarah," Linda said, reaching across the table to grab my hand. "It just means you're human. And honestly, the nurses who face their own darkness often make the best caregivers. They understand suffering." Something shifted in that moment, like tectonic plates realigning after an earthquake. The fog didn't lift, but I could see through it for the first time in months. Linda stayed for 3 hours helping me create a plan. First, get back to therapy consistently. Second, return to work part-time to rebuild confidence. Third, stop letting shame dictate my choices. "Your father weaponized your illness," she said as she left, "but you don't have to hand him ammunition anymore." I started going to therapy twice a week, not to be fixed, but to be heard. Dr. Martinez, a woman who'd replaced Dr. Roberts when I said I needed someone my father couldn't influence, helped me see the patterns I'd been blind to. "You've been trained since childhood to earn love through perfection," she explained during our third session, her office plants thriving in a way that gave me hope. Your family's love was transactional, conditional on your usefulness. But that's not love, Sarah, that's employment. And you've been laid off from a job you never should have had to do. The support group she recommended met Wednesday evenings in a church basement, though it wasn't religious. Just a circle of people who'd been discarded by family for having mental illness, each story a variation on the same theme of shame and abandonment. There was Marcus, whose wife left him during his bipolar diagnosis. Jennifer, whose parents told their church she was possessed rather than depressed. David, whose brothers staged an intervention to tell him he was embarrassing them by taking antidepressants. We were all damaged goods in someone's eyes, but to each other, we were survivors. I went back to work part-time, 3 days a week in the pediatric ward. The first day, I was terrified. Hands shaking as I badged in, certain everyone was staring. But my colleagues rallied around me like a protective wall. Dr. Harrison personally requested me for his rounds, making it clear he trusted me completely. The nurses threw an impromptu welcome back party in the break room, complete with a cake that said "Mental Health Matters" in green frosting. One parent whose daughter I'd cared for during her leukemia treatment hugged me and whispered, "We heard you were sick. We're glad you're better. Healing yourself means you can keep healing others." I started running every morning, not to punish my body but to celebrate what it could do. 3 miles along the river path, watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold, my feet finding rhythm on the pavement. My body, the one that had betrayed me with panic attacks and trembling hands, could still carry me forward. It was still strong, still capable, still mine. The medication helped. Not a crutch, but a tool. Like glasses for the mind. I wasn't weak for needing it any more than diabetics were weak for needing insulin. Slowly, painfully, I began rebuilding. Not the old Sarah who needed to be perfect, but someone new. Someone who could be whole with cracks in her foundation. I didn't plan revenge. I planned survival. But sometimes they look the same. The first step was documentation, methodical and thorough, like charting patient histories. I created a file of my own, keeping every text from Michael gloating about his inheritance, every email from Dad's business associates mentioning my breakdown, every social media post where my parents pretended I didn't exist. Their Christmas card that year featured Mom, Dad, and Michael in matching sweaters, the Coleman family printed in gold script, as if I'd been edited out of existence. I kept that too. Evidence of erasure. I consulted a lawyer about defamation, though I never intended to sue. Catherine Morgan specialized in workplace harassment and listened to my story with the kind of focused attention that made me feel heard for the first time in months. "You have a case," she said, sliding documentation across her mahogany desk. "Your father's interference with your employment, the false statements to board members, the coordinated campaign to damage your professional reputation. It's textbook defamation with malicious intent." She quoted fees I couldn't afford and outcomes that would take years to achieve, but knowledge was power. Just knowing I could fight back legally made me stand straighter. Instead of legal battles, I chose professional excellence. I threw myself into psychiatric nursing with the passion of someone who'd lived the curriculum. I understood medication resistance because I'd felt it, recognized the shame in patients' eyes because I'd worn it, knew which words wounded and which ones healed. Within 6 months, I'd become the go-to nurse for difficult cases. The teenagers who wouldn't talk, the mothers hiding postpartum depression, the executives who couldn't admit weakness. My supervisor noticed, then the department head, then the hospital administration. I published my first article in the American Journal of Nursing, "When Healers Need Healing, Mental Health Stigma in Medical Professionals." I never named my family, but I told our story in statistics and case studies, in carefully anonymized anecdotes that painted a picture of how stigma destroyed families and lives. The article went viral in medical circles, shared thousands of times, sparking conversations in break rooms and board meetings about how we treat our own when they struggle. Speaking invitations followed, first local hospitals, then conferences, then a keynote at the Colorado Healthcare Summit where, ironically, several of Dad's board member friends were in attendance. Meanwhile, I watched from a careful distance as Michael took over parts of Dad's business. His incompetence was almost comical if it hadn't been so predictable. Within 3 months, he'd lost the Riverside development contract by showing up drunk to a client meeting. Within 6 months, he'd driven away Dad's best foreman with his entitled attitude and inability to read blueprints. His mistakes cost hundreds of thousands. Concrete poured wrong, permits filed incorrectly, deadlines missed because he couldn't wake up before noon. Dad scrambled to cover for him, throwing money at problems, hiring consultants to do Michael's job while Michael collected a salary for playing video games in the office Dad had built for him. I started dating again, carefully, slowly, with the wisdom of someone who'd learned that love shouldn't require performance. Tom appeared in my life like a surprise chapter in a book I thought had ended. We met at a bookstore, both reaching for the same copy of a meditation guide, laughing at the coincidence. He saw my antidepressants on the counter during our third date and simply asked, "How long have you been managing it?" No judgment, no fear, just curiosity and care. He had his own therapist, his own struggles with anxiety, his own understanding that mental health was just health, nothing more or less. I built friendships with intention, choosing people who celebrated my therapy appointments like promotions, who understood that some days were harder than others, who didn't require perfection as the price of admission. My Thursday night dinner group became family. 5 women who'd all been rejected by blood relatives for various unforgivable sins like divorce, sexuality, career choices, or in my case, brain chemistry. We called ourselves the refugees, and we gave each other what our families couldn't: unconditional acceptance. The plan wasn't about destroying anyone, it was about building something so beautiful, so undeniably successful, that their narrative about me would crumble under the weight of reality. Every published article, every speaking engagement, every patient whose life I touched became a brick in the wall of my new life. They'd tried to bury me, not knowing I was a seed. 6 years passed like seasons I learned to weather differently. I married Tom in a small ceremony by the lake, surrounded by the family we'd chosen rather than the one I'd been born into. My colleagues from the hospital, my refugees dinner group, Tom's wonderfully chaotic family who'd adopted me without question. These were the faces that watched me walk down the aisle, not looking for perfection, but celebrating love that had grown from broken ground. We bought a house with a real garden where I finally grew those tomatoes, their vines reaching toward the sun like hope made tangible. Our daughters came in quick succession: Lucy with Tom's dark eyes and my stubborn chin, then Emma 2 years later, a whirlwind of curls and laughter. I promised them from their first breaths that they would never have to earn my love, never have to be perfect to be worthy, never have to hide their struggles behind practiced smiles. When Lucy had anxiety about starting kindergarten, we talked about it openly, gave her tools to cope, celebrated her bravery in naming her fears. There would be no shameful secrets in our house, no mental illness hidden like contraband in our family tree. I'd built a life that didn't include my birth family, though Mom occasionally sent birthday cards I didn't open, leaving them in a drawer like artifacts from another civilization. Michael's failures had become local legend in construction circles, the Coleman empire crumbling under his management while Dad aged, rapidly trying to hold it together. I heard updates through professional networks, each mistake validating what I'd always known. Being the stable one had nothing to do with mental health and everything to do with competence, dedication, and actually showing up. Then came the call at 11 p.m. on a Thursday in March. I was reviewing patient charts at the kitchen table, Tom reading beside me, our daughters long asleep upstairs. My phone lit up with Mom's number, unusual since she typically respected the boundaries I'd established through years of silence. I almost didn't answer, but something, instinct maybe, or that vestigial organ of daughterly duty, made me swipe accept. It wasn't Mom's voice, but Dad's, broken in a way I'd never heard before. Not the controlled anger I knew, not the dismissive coldness I'd learned to expect, but raw, desperate sobbing. "Sarah," he gasped, and I could hear machines beeping in the background, the unmistakable soundtrack of a hospital. "It's Michael. He tried to. He took pills. So many pills. Sarah, he tried to kill himself." The irony was a knife between ribs, sharp and precise. The golden child, the stable one, the son who didn't have mental illness in his genes. He'd swallowed what the nurse would later tell me was roughly 60 Xanax tablets, chased with a bottle of 18-year-old scotch from Dad's private collection. His note was brief. "Can't do this anymore. Tell Sarah she was right." They pumped his stomach, Dad continued, his voice cracking like ice over deep water. "He's alive, but he won't talk to anyone except he keeps asking for you. Only you. Please, Sarah. Please come." The word please from my father's mouth sounded foreign, like he was speaking a language he'd never learned. "We don't know what to do. We don't understand. How did this happen? He was fine. He was normal. He was depressed," I said quietly, the words falling into silence. Tom looked up from his book, concern creasing his face. I could hear Dad breathing, ragged and confused, the sound of a man whose entire worldview had just collapsed. The son he'd bet everything on, the heir who was supposed to prove mental illness wasn't in our blood, had just provided the most devastating evidence to the contrary. "He's at Presbyterian," Dad whispered. "Room 4012. Please, Sarah. He says you'll understand. He says you survived this. Please teach us how to help him. Please come home." Home. As if that word still meant something between us. As if 6 years of silence could be erased by crisis. I looked at Tom, who nodded without me having to explain, already reaching for his car keys. "We'll be there in 20 minutes, I said, and hung up before Dad could respond. It was time to face the ruins of the family that had tried to bury me. I walked into that hospital room with Tom beside me and my daughters safe at my mother-in-law's house. The room was packed. Not just immediate family, but aunts, uncles, Dad's business partners, family friends, the entire Coleman network summoned to witness the golden child's fall. They parted like water as I entered, some avoiding eye contact, others staring with undisguised curiosity at the prodigal daughter who'd been erased from family narratives for 6 years. Michael looked small in the hospital bed, his skin gray, eyes hollow in a way I recognized from my own mirror years ago. The room fell silent as Michael reached for my hand, his fingers cold and trembling. His voice was barely a whisper, raw from the tube they'd used to pump his stomach. "Sarah, how did you survive this? The darkness, the weight of it all. How are you still here? How did you not?" He couldn't finish, but he didn't need to. Everyone knew what he meant. How had I not done what he'd just tried to do? I looked around the room, making eye contact with each person who'd been present for my exile. Mr. Chen from Dad's golf club, the Hendersons who'd whispered about me at the country club, Uncle Richard who'd told everyone I'd gone crazy at the last family reunion I'd attended. Then I looked at Dad. His emperor's armor cracked, his face aged beyond the 6 years since I'd seen him. "I got help," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. I took medication. I went to therapy. I admitted I was sick and sought treatment instead of hiding behind pride. I turned back to Michael, squeezing his hand gently. But wait, there's no mental illness in this family, remember? Dad made that very clear when he called me damaged goods in front of everyone. When he told my fiancé to leave me because mental illness is genetic and would taint his future children. Gasps rippled through the room. Mrs. Henderson actually covered her mouth in shock. When he systematically destroyed my career to protect the family image. So this must be something else, right, Dad? Because we don't have mental illness in this family. Mr. Chen, Dad's business partner, shifted uncomfortably. Is this true, Robert? You denied your daughter help for mental illness? His own son had attempted suicide in college. I knew because I'd cared for him during his psychiatric hold 5 years ago, though I'd never broken confidentiality. You told us she had a nervous breakdown from work stress, that she was unstable, unfit. But you never said you refused her treatment. She was weak, Dad started, but his voice faltered as he looked at Michael in the bed, his precious son hooked to the same monitors I'd once been connected to. I thought if we were strong enough. But here's the twist that changed everything. Mom finally spoke, stepping out from the corner where she'd been silently crying. Enough, she said, her voice steady for the first time in my memory. Enough lies, Robert. She reached into her purse and pulled out a prescription bottle, holding it up for everyone to see. I've been seeing a therapist for 15 years. Dr. Patricia Reeves, downtown. Behind your back. Paying cash so you wouldn't see the insurance statements. The room went completely silent except for the steady beep of Michael's heart monitor. Depression and anxiety, Mom continued, each word gaining strength. Just like Sarah, just like Michael, just like my mother before me, who you insisted was just emotional. I'm the reason there's mental illness in this family, Robert. It came from my genes, my bloodline, the one you were so proud to marry into for the social status. She laughed, bitter and sharp. I've been hiding pills and vitamin bottles, lying about book clubs that were therapy appointments, pretending to be the perfect wife while dying inside just like our children. She walked over to Michael's bed, touching his face gently. I failed you both by keeping silent, by letting him convince me that hiding was better than healing. Sarah got help despite us. You nearly died because of us. She turned to face the room, addressing the audience like she was giving a testimony. My husband would rather have dead children than admit mental illness exists in our family. I chose his pride over their lives. That ends today. Dad stood frozen, his empire of lies crumbling publicly, witnessed by everyone whose opinion he'd valued more than his children's lives. The fallout was swift and merciless. Within a week, word had spread through Dad's entire professional network about what had really happened, not through malicious gossip, but through the inevitable collapse of a lie too big to maintain. Mr. Chen was the first to pull his contracts, quietly but firmly, telling Dad he couldn't do business with someone who valued reputation over his own children's lives. The Hendersons followed, then the Riverside Development Group, then 3 more major clients. Dad's construction empire, built on handshakes and trust, crumbled when that trust evaporated. Michael entered intensive therapy at the same psychiatric facility that I'd recommended 6 years ago, the one Dad had called a loony bin when I'd suggested it for myself. I visited him twice a week, teaching him what I'd learned. That medication wasn't weakness, that therapy wasn't failure, that healing wasn't linear. We sat in the garden during visiting hours, and he told me about the pressure that had eaten him alive, being the chosen one, the stable son, the heir to an empire he didn't want and couldn't manage. Every mistake I made, Dad covered up, he said during our 3rd visit, his hands steady now on the right medication. But I knew I was failing. I knew I was proving everything you'd done right, and it was killing me. Our relationship would never be close. Too much damage, Too many years of him participating in my exile, but shared pain created understanding. He started calling me when the darkness crept in, and I always answered, even at 2 a.m., because I knew what it felt like to need a voice in that darkness. He apologized eventually for his part in everything. Not a grand gesture, just quiet words over coffee. I was jealous. You were everything Dad said he wanted. Successful, responsible, strong. But he chose me because I was male and stable. Turns out I was neither. Mom divorced Dad after 40 years of marriage, filing papers the day Michael was released from the hospital. She moved into a small apartment near me, walking distance from our house, finally free to be herself without apology. We have coffee every Wednesday morning at the same cafe where Jake and I used to go, both of us taking our medication with our lattes, both of us learning how to be honest. She's in my daughters' lives now, teaching them to bake while telling them stories about feelings. All kinds of feelings, the ones we celebrate and the ones we need help carrying. She told me things during those coffee mornings that recontextualized my entire childhood. How she'd been hospitalized for postpartum depression after I was born, but Dad had told everyone she was visiting her sick mother. How her own mother had been institutionalized in the 1960s for what was probably bipolar disorder, erased from family photos and conversations. How she'd watched me struggle and wanted to help, but was paralyzed by 40 years of being told that acknowledgement meant failure. I chose my prison, she said one morning, watching Lucy and Emma play at the park. But I let him make it yours too. That's what I can't forgive myself for. Dad lives alone now in his big house, surrounded by the success that means nothing. His business exists but diminished, run by hired managers while he sits in his study, bourbon in hand, calling relatives who no longer answer. He sent one letter, 6 months after Michael's attempt, 6 pages of justification wrapped in something that might have been apology if you squinted. I read it once, then filed it with all the other documentation, not out of anger, but out of completeness. Even this was part of the story, his inability to truly admit wrong, to say the words, "I'm sorry," without qualifiers. The last time I saw him was at Michael's wedding a year later, a small ceremony where Dad sat in the back row while I stood as a groomsperson, Michael's request that surprised everyone, including me. Dad looked older, smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of consequences. When he approached me during the reception, I didn't run. "Sarah," he said, his voice uncertain, "you look well." "I am well," I replied, then walked away to dance with my daughters, leaving him standing alone by the bar, finally understanding what it felt like to be deemed unworthy of someone's time. The last time I saw my father was at Michael's wedding last spring. He looked older, smaller somehow, like his body had finally shaped itself to match the size of his heart. When he approached me during the reception, Tom instinctively moved closer, protective, but I touched his arm gently. I didn't need protection anymore. "Sarah," Dad said, his voice uncertain, aged bourbon on his breath. "You look well." "I am well," I replied and meant it. Not perfect, not cured, but well. My wellness wasn't for him to validate anymore. I watched him search for more words, perhaps an apology, maybe another justification, but I didn't wait to find out. I walked away to dance with my daughters, Lucy standing on my feet while Emma twirled beside us, their laughter medicine no pharmacy could bottle. Dad stood alone by the bar, finally experiencing what it felt like to be deemed unworthy of someone's time, to be the one reaching out to someone who'd learned to stop reaching back. Here's what I learned in those dark years. Lessons written in tears and medication adjustments, in therapy sessions and support group meetings, in the faces of my daughters who will never question whether they're loved. Mental illness doesn't discriminate. It doesn't care about your family's reputation, your father's construction empire, your perfect GPA, or your spotless work record. It's not a character flaw or a moral failing or something you can outrun by being good enough, successful enough, strong enough. It's a medical condition, as real as diabetes, as treatable as high blood pressure, as manageable as any chronic illness when you stop hiding and start healing. The real shame, the only shame, is in denial, in choosing image over health, in letting pride prevent healing. My father thought admitting mental illness would destroy our family. In reality, denying it nearly killed both his children. He gained a reputation as a strong man who didn't believe in weakness and lost everything that mattered in the process. His construction empire still stands, diminished but profitable. But his legacy is two children who survived despite him, not because of him. His grandchildren don't know his name. His ex-wife found happiness at 65, free from the prison of his pride. His story became a cautionary tale whispered at hospital fundraisers and country clubs, the man who chose reputation over reality and lost both. Sometimes the family you're born into isn't the family you're meant to keep. Blood relation doesn't grant anyone the right to deny your reality, to weaponize your illness, to make you choose between their love and your life. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away, build something new, and refuse to inherit the generational trauma disguised as family tradition. My daughters will never hear that mental illness doesn't exist in our family. They'll grow up knowing that mommy takes medicine for her brain the same way grandma takes medicine for her heart, and there's no shame in either. Sometimes damage isn't something you are, but something done to you. Every cruel word, every public humiliation, every denial of your struggle, these are injuries inflicted, not inherent flaws. And like any injury, they can heal with proper care, leaving scars that remind you not of weakness, but of survival. My scars are invisible but real, and I'm not ashamed of them anymore. They're proof that I survived a war fought in my own mind and a family that treated my illness as betrayal. And sometimes, most importantly, the very thing that makes you damaged goods in one person's eyes makes you invaluable to someone else who's struggling in the dark. My mental illness, the thing that made my father disown me, became the foundation of my psychiatric nursing specialty. The experience that cost me my first fiancé led me to a husband who sees my therapy appointments as self-care, not weakness. The breakdown that my father tried to hide became the breakthrough that saved not just my life, but the lives of countless patients who needed someone who truly understood. My name is Sarah Coleman Morrison. I have clinical depression and generalized anxiety disorder. I take 50 milligrams of sertraline every morning with my coffee. I see my therapist twice a month, more if I need it. I am a psychiatric nurse, a wife, a mother, a survivor, and a thriver. I am living proof that mental illness doesn't disqualify you from a beautiful life. I am not damaged goods. I never was, and neither are you. What would you do if you were in her place? Tell us in the comments below. If you're struggling with mental illness or family rejection, remember, you are not alone, you are not broken, and you deserve support. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it today.